cemetery at West Heslington looked like newcomers from the continent, and yet most of them were born in Britain. If this change wasn't the result of invasion, what was going on? There were profound cultural changes in the 5th century, and perhaps the most significant was language. There is no doubt that spoken language changed from native British, sometimes called Celtic, to English, which was a descendant of German. Surely this, if anything, has to be proof of the Anglo Saxon invasion. Modern linguistics, however, are beginning to question this assumption. Katie Lowe has been looking at the traces of native British grammar in modern English.
It's come down to us that we simply know as a fact that the Celtic languages just didn't really affect modern English. And I think that basically stopped people looking. They just thought, well, there simply can't be any influence at all.
But linguists have discovered a hidden code in our language structure, which shows a strong influence from the Britons.
If you're a Celt and you're trying to learn Old English, just like any second language acquisition, you're going to make mistakes. I mean, if you go to France today, you're bound to make mistakes which really show structure from your own language. So, for example, you might make mistakes in syntax, you might make mistakes in vocabulary. Of course, your accent will be very strange as well. And it's thought that perhaps some of the Celtic structure of the language affected English.
In the process of learning English, the native Britons retained the structure of their own languages, and these ancient patterns are still visible in the grammatical structure of modern English.
Old English was really rather like German in structure, and the way you constructed a sentence was based largely on endings that indicated what a word was doing within a sentence. Nowadays, word order is all important. If I say the cat chased the man, it does not mean the same as the other way round.
In German, word endings and not word order would have told us who was chasing whom. So why did the English language undergo this strange mutation?
We've shifted to a different kind of word order within a sentence. Where's that come from? Because it doesn't seem to have happened quite so much within any of the other Germanic languages. Recent research has shown that the Celtic languages had a part to play in this. There has to be contact. There has to be contact over generations, and there's no other way of doing it.
The rise of English in these islands came not from a tidal wave of invaders, but from a prolonged period of contact, during which the native Britons chose to adopt a new way of speaking. But why did this happen? Archaeologist Sam Lucy has been examining graves from the period to understand why this dramatic cultural change took place.
So this would be similar to some of the graves they found at West Heslington?
Yeah, very similar. Up by his head, you've got the metal tip of a spear, and the wooden shaft has rotted away. You've got down over his hip the metal centre of a bigger wooden and leather shield.
Just as the language of the native Britons changed in this period, so too did their style of clothes and weapons.
At the end of the Roman period, a lot of objects that you find changed. Why was that?
I mean, it's traditionally been attributed to Anglo-Saxon migrations or Anglo-Saxon invasions. You do certainly start to get different burial rites. Women tend to get buried with a much greater variety of dress furnishings. This is a brooch type that's known as a cruciform brooch, a cross-shaped brooch. Yeah. And this brooch isn't a continental import. Its idea came ultimately from the continent, but it is a British product. The people living in Britain are perhaps aligning themselves more to a continental style and continental ideas. So I think it's that sort of process that's going on, rather than population replacement, which is what the traditional idea of Anglo-Saxon migrations involves.
The mistake has been to take cultural artifacts as evidence of racial origin.
If I were wearing American jeans, that doesn't make me an American. If I'm driving a German car, that doesn't make me German. It doesn't work like that.
There can be no doubt that a trickle of warriors and families on the move were coming into Britain from the countries of Northern Europe in this period. But the traditional picture of invasion and population replacement is unsustainable. The people of Britain learnt a new language, adopted new fashions, and shifted their political allegiances because they knew from experience that this was the best way to keep up with the rapidly changing times. It was only in later centuries that the complex details of this process were transformed into a captivating story. History books can be dangerous things, especially when they're brilliantly written. In 731, a Tyneside monk named the Venerable Bede finished his ecclesiastical history of the English people, which still forms the basis of modern history lessons. But Bede, like all historians, had his own particular axe to grind. According to Bede, the origins of the church in England lie in 6th century Rome, where Pope Gregory the Great spotted some beautiful fair-haired slaves for sale. Upon being told that they were Angles from the pagan island of Britain, he famously replied that to him they looked more like angels. According to Bede, Gregory immediately makes arrangements for St. Augustine to sail to Britain and convert these heathen creatures to Christianity. To make Augustine's mission more significant than it actually was, Bede portrays Britain as a country populated by heathen unbelievers. He calls these pagans the Anglo Saxons and describes their conversion as a glorious achievement. In creating this story, Bede gives the church a fresh start in Britain. The newly converted Anglo-Saxon English are depicted as proper Christians, unconnected to the murky Celtic Christianity of the native Britons.
Bede is writing this story 200, 300 years after it happened, so he's trying to present it as a coherent process. Therefore, it's in his interest to make things tidier and more organised, perhaps, than they really were. In fact, Christianity is big by the late Roman period. Augustine arrives in the end of the 6th century. He's already stepping into a country that knew all about Christianity. And when Augustine arrives, by invitation, he finds an island where there are already Christians and bishops and organised church life exists in parts of the island. So there are different streams of Christianity.
The conventional wisdom would have it that the Anglo-Saxons brought with them paganism from abroad, and that Christianity wasn't introduced to England until 597 when St. Augustine arrived in Canterbury. What do you say to that?
I don't believe a word of it. The British Church survived intact, and it was flourishing. The missionaries thought they were coming to barbarian Ruritania. And when they got here, here was a church with its own traditions intact from antiquity. Men who knew how to operate 10 different computational cycles for the reckoning of Easter. They could write classier prose and verse than the Roman missionaries were capable of. So the Roman missionaries found intact a church completely self-possessed. They were so dumbfounded by this that they just blanked it out. They pretended that it had never existed. They pretended that it didn't exist.
In order to gloss over the messy origins of English Christianity, Bede invented a new race of people, the Anglo-Saxons, who came to be known as the English.
Bede has an agenda to present the Anglo-Saxons as a coherent body of people, and they're predestined to inherit southern Britain. Rather like the children of Israel inherit the Holy Land, and they inherit it from the British, according to Bede, because the British are unfit to live here. So the English are a chosen people.
Bede's influence is all the more extraordinary when you realise that he never ventured out of the monastery in Tyneside where he was brought up.
We know that Bede had particular reasons for writing his history. One of them was really to create a sense of the English. In doing so, he gave us an origin myth.
Do you think that Bede did invent England?
He certainly invented the notion of an English people. What you have to realise is that England doesn't exist before perhaps the 9th, 10th century. It's only later on that you can actually call it a single political nation, if you like. Before this point, you're looking at much smaller, territorially based groupings largely. And so Bede, in writing that ecclesiastical history, is creating that sense of the English, or starting to create that sense.
In telling the story of the Anglo Saxon invasion, Bede laid the groundwork for an English identity. But I don't believe this version represents who we are as a nation. My journey into the story of Britain AD has uncovered a very different picture of the people of this island. So who are we really? Whether we hark back to Arthur or the Anglo-Saxons, we Brits have always used history to create a national identity for ourselves. The trouble is, these are identities based on a wholly imagined past, so we end up not knowing who we really are. Go to the heart of our democracy, and you see what I mean. When the Victorians decided to decorate the robing room here in the House of Lords, they chose to use the figure of King Arthur. The Victorians had revived the Anglo-Saxon invasion myth with vigour. The invasion identified the noble English as descending from pure Teutonic stock, as distinct from the irrational, undisciplined Celts. In the paintings, King Arthur, a native British warrior from our Dark Age past, had to be made to fit the Anglo-Saxon virtues of the Victorian age. The result was a ludicrous conflation of two very separate aspects of our national identity. British identity just wasn't that simple.
In the 19th century, at the same time that Anglo-Saxon archaeologists, Anglo-Saxon historians are writing the history of the English, you get, if you want to call them that, Celtic historians doing the same for the Welsh and the Irish and the Scottish. And it's actually in direct opposition to each other. They don't happen in a vacuum, they're done in direct consequence of each other. You see very deliberate manipulation of historical sources and archaeology to try to create a sense of history.
The early centuries of Britain AD were formative years in the making of this country's identity.
It is not just the British who are being exercised by their early medieval past. It is the Germans, it is the French. It is right across Europe. If we are now looking to find our roots, who are we? What is our identity? We almost invariably end up in the early Middle Ages, in the immediate post-Roman period, which removed a common culture and created little groups, smaller units, to which we can look and say, this is where I'm coming from. And perhaps you will agree, in my view, what the past is all about is identity.
Our ancestors were not brave Anglo Saxon supermen, nor mysterious Celtic warriors like Arthur.